Welcome back to Geomancy. As always, thank you so much for joining me. Today, we're going to be taking a little walk. A walk through some historic cemeteries that hold significance on a historical level, a metaphysical level, and they seem to play an interesting role in our current timeline. This is Greenwood Cemetery, located in Brooklyn, New York. And as you can see already, it's a sight to behold. This place was said to have been founded in 1838, and it sits on 478 acres. Buried here are some of the most prominent founding people of New York history, like Governor DeWitt Clinton, seen here, and many, many, many others. But what you find when you walk around these grounds is a sense of power that's hard to put into words. If you've walked around historic cemeteries, you probably know what I'm talking about, but you get the sense that people had an understanding of things far different than what we do today. A cool 20-something years after this park was founded, by the 1860s, it was the nation's second largest tourist attraction, only behind Niagara Falls in Buffalo, which I've also shown in a few other America is the Old Worlds. Half a million visitors came to this place a year in the late 1800s. A cemetery. Can you believe that? Really makes you wonder, what is really going on here? What are cemeteries? Why did people put so much emphasis and importance on these monuments? And not just that, the most important people seem to really take care in their eternal resting place. Now, I should also mention, as I'm walking around these places, I try to pay my respects and honor whoever is memorialized here. But you can learn so much just by walking around and catching a glimpse. This park often features concerts and programs like this concert. And this took place in the center of the entire cemetery, where we find the oldest graves that we can see here. And these gravestones are pretty much all Dutch for the most part. And that makes sense because, as I've talked about several times before, New York was called New Amsterdam, and it was a Dutch colony. And I've also mentioned how these headstones even resemble Dutch gables, the architectural form that we've talked about a few times before. So what we try to do is figure out the identities of these people. Figure out who was living, who was doing what. You can see so many different symbols throughout these cemeteries. Occult symbols, spiritual symbols, religious symbols, and otherwise. You see that people took great pride in where they were going to lay eternally and how they were going to symbolize that. This was one of the most unique monuments in the whole place. The Zodiac. We see a nice Moorish mausoleum. A handful of lakes throughout. Really beautiful place. Egyptian motifs. I hear they have lakefront property available. Quiet neighbors. Good neighborhood. Clearly, as we go through here, you can see the importance of the afterlife. Nice last name. You can see that great emphasis was put. And it makes me wonder, what did they know about what happens after death that us in our modern world don't quite grasp? They didn't just do all this just for fun. I think cemeteries are way more important than most people would give credit. I feel like they're a topic that deserves more attention within the hidden history community. Thomas Negus. Negus meaning royalty in Ethiopian Semitic languages. Going down south, I've shown this Freemasons Hall before in Savannah, Georgia. And this happens to be a grave of a Freemason in Savannah, Georgia. And Laurel Grove South Cemetery, as I mentioned previously, is a so-called all-black cemetery. Yet we see very prominent individuals here. This is where seemingly higher echelons of society were buried. I'll leave links in the description to some more information about these places, and you can read about some of the people buried. But for example, Habersham is a major street in Savannah. Broughton is a major street in Savannah. Drayton is another major street in Savannah. So here you have the names of several of the most prominent streets in this city, seemingly named after so-called black people. And I use the term so-called because the story of the identity of so-called black people is much deeper than that, as I've touched on. But in the South, which we are told is racist and unjust towards black people, especially in the 1800s and 1900s, we find prominent people all over. Now, if you understand that Georgia was a colony of Britain, actually named for King George, and you've caught on that I've mentioned and described who King George was and what he looked like, it may actually not be surprising that the South does in fact have many prominent so-called black people at a time we were taught things were quite unjust, as much as they may have been. This cemetery was super interesting because you can also tell a level of sophistication and status when reading these headstones and reading about these people. And you could sense that they were upstanding people and played a large role in Savannah society at their time. Again with the Dutch looking headstone, and that one's buried deep, and it's also next to the tree, another one in a vault. The Bryans, there's also a Bryan Street in Savannah and a Bryan County. Now this cemetery is Colonial Park, said to have been founded in 1750, and this is a little more in the center of Savannah. Now, this cemetery was closed to burials in 1853, before the Civil War. So, allegedly, no Civil War soldiers were buried here. But it also has about 700 victims from the yellow fever epidemic in the early 1800s. How old are these tombs, really? These are many of the headstones of the yellow fever epidemic. And you can tell that they were quite young. So this makes me wonder, what's going on in the context of resets with epidemics? There seems to be a theme. Levi Rist was only 35 years old in 1819. A Blackmar, a Blackamoor. In Charleston, we have another city with a lot of history and a lot of ties to 16th, 17th, and 18th century European aristocracy. What's interesting about South Carolina is that there were a large population of free people of color who owned slaves. Actually, the largest slaveholder in South Carolina name was William Ellison. These are things we're not taught. But as it pertains to resets, the identities of people is very important because we're trying to figure out what was going on in the 1800s, the 1700s, what was being set up, who are these people? Maybe you're like me and you assume identity based on name or nationality. We must begin to now go beyond assumption. The last cemetery we're going to look at is in Philadelphia, and it's Laurel Hill Cemetery. So in Savannah, we were at Laurel Grove. Philly, we're at Laurel Hill. And immediately I noticed some rather nice block work. Cemeteries are often on very high points, mounds, and this gets back into the metaphysical side of things. Why the need for such ornate tombstones and monuments? Getting back to my electricity idea, what if these cemeteries are also major nodes on the grid, and the plots themselves are actually nodes as well? And what if after death, once we are no longer confined to our physical form, we may enter and exit this realm? But in order to do that, perhaps a certain technology is needed. An antenna, so to speak. Clothier was a co-founder of the department store Strawbridge's, which no longer exists. What's beneath? These cemeteries, I don't know. There's something about them. You find very, very, very old trees. Trees that seem to predate the age of the cemetery. On the left, you'll see the biggest monument belonging to Henry Diston. If this is what the rich and powerful do when they transition, what do they know that we don't know? Were you planning on being buried or entombed like this? I wasn't, but I am now. I don't know, I get the feeling that these cemeteries, there's something more to them But I also have the feeling that it's obvious. We just don't have the level of understanding yet to really get it. Now, this tree grew around the stone, and that was a huge old tree. So how old is that retaining wall? If they tell us that Laurel Hill was founded in 1836. Now, not every single grave in these cemeteries is mind-blowingly significant or noteworthy. That's not to say the person is not. But I highly recommend you read this and pause it as you need to, because this is probably one of the most significant messages on any grave. What did you think of that? One of the biggest takeaways from my explorations of these old grave sites is that the people that lived and died in the 17 and 1800s were very spiritually adept. More than I think we realize, more than we give credit to. And it's almost like all of these cemeteries were founded in our favorite century, the 1800s. Here you find names, very interesting names that we don't see today. I think this is an indication of resets. A huge sycamore growing around this tree. Well, that is all I have for this one. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you got something out of this, give it a thumbs up, share it with somebody, use it for your own reference. But either way, take care, be well.